Over a century, from 1800 to 1900, the concept of travel and distance was radically and significantly changed. In 1812, it took an average of 6 days to travel stage across the rugged mountain barriers from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. 40 years later, the same trip could be made by train in just 16 hours, and by the end of the century, the entire run took just a single morning. Between 1900 and 1920, the U.S. went from 8,000 cars to 8 million automobiles owned. In the 1930s, a movement for the interstate highway system began, as well as safety for travelers. The idea of vacationing and tourism pushed more Americans to go out on the road. The increase of a more mobile traveler shifted the way cities and communities were built. Commercial cores began to leave typical main streets and extend to a miracle mile, which became a corridor lined with an array of signs and lights, buildings, parking lots, all designed to catch the eye of the motoring public. During the 1920s and 30s, domestic styles of architecture were used for service stations. In the 1940s, the buildings transitioned into the Art Deco and modern design, with an emphasis on eye-catching signage. Slowly, development patterns of communities shifted to the use of the automobile, especially following World War II. The standard idea of housing and family coincided with the creation of subdivisions, fenced-in yards, and streets wide enough for kids to play outdoors. Returning veterans and a bump in the economy established more disposable incomes for families to enjoy things like vacation and traveling. Roadside service stations became a staple along thoroughfares and highways, with motels and drive-ins alike. Gas stations began as domestic designs, sheds and cottages, then the addition of canopies, bays, and finally the oblong box design. While driving your automobile, there was a need for on-the-go maintenance, and these gas stations slowly evolved to include other items like auto parts, oils, and tools. After World War II, Americans used their new wealth to travel. Oil and gas companies worked hard to define their corporate identity and brand that would encourage travelers to pick their station over someone else's. This cultural transition occurred during the space age, which influenced the design of the modern gas station. New space age stations consisted of flared rooflines, vertical pylons, and these common devices were used by larger corporations to identify their brands as well as displaying their company logos. Phillips Petroleum led the change in mid-century station design with their V-shaped roofline. In the 1960s, Lady Bird Johnson requested that service stations participate in the Highway Beautification Act, which had gas stations become more connected with the American landscape. The V-shaped roofline was an alteration to the previous oblong box design, extending a canopy outward and upward over the pump stations. After the Highway Beautification Act of 1965, environmental and domestic design stopped using wood shingles and mansard roofs. Post-World War II stations often included curb cuts, gas pumps, pump islands, driveways, parking areas, and service areas, as well as signs, canopies, and overhead garage doors used for repair. These stations were set back slightly and paved to allow for automobile traffic to easily enter and quickly enter the station. The V-shaped double hyperbolic paraboloid and bat-wing designs were a visual cue to passers-by that the station was ahead and they would receive a consistent and quality service. This, of course, is a reference to their new form of corporate branding. The V-shaped canopy runs the full length of the front elevation of the building and tapers out and upward toward the road, creating a triangular or V shape. paved fuel pump islands were covered by the projecting canopies that extend over the main building. The main building housed the salesman's office, restrooms for customers, and service bays for needed repairs and maintenance. The canopies are supported by columns and piers consisting of pairs of two vertical poles. These designs were constructed with masonry materials, concrete blocks, and some stone veneers, depending on which company. The idea of symbolism, logos, and corporate development evolved after World War II, and the gas station became a focal point. The post-war design aesthetics changed with the rise of new abstract styles from icons like Christian Dior, Jackson Pollock, and Herman Miller. This directly influenced the way companies approached their product lines and marketing. Philips was no exception to this trend and decided to embark on a new look that would shift the company image from a family-run business to a modern corporation. Philips had already grafted a flamboyant V-shaped canopy onto a new look service station in 1956 in Fort Lauderdale. A few years later, versions of the distinctive canopy would soar nationwide. The design change occurred over 3 phases. The first was rock-faced and slanted windows. This began in the early 1950s. The next phase involved the change in colors with bright red, diamond, and triangular shapes. By the early 1960s, the 3 phases incorporated the previous 2 and added the bat wing canopy design. This was called the Harlequin design. All of the Philips 66 service stations included standard elements like 2 restrooms, storage space, and a salesman's office. With the investment of the interstate highway system, Philips planned to expand its reach and create a new breed of service station that would focus on meeting consumer travel needs. At the time, the Philips model consisted first of purchasing the land, then building the stations, and then leasing the properties back to their dealers. This pushed them to develop an inexpensive build design. Clarence Reinhardt, who worked at Philips since the 1920s, was inspired by 1950s drive-ins around the Los Angeles metro. He surmised that an essential element of drive-in success was the eye-popping architecture. All of his variations and stations included an upwardly canted triangular canopy, a design influenced by the fins found on automobiles and rockets of the period. The new look was designed to be spacious, open, busy, and have attractive colors. The idea was that the station would face traffic and appeal to travelers with a revolving sign on a vertical column. The pointed shape and supporting pylon are distinctive designs, conveying to the motoring public that this is another advanced Philips 66 station. The design of the uplifted canopy and central island created an open line of sight between the salesman's office and his customers. The transition to this new design and colors would also bring more women into the stations. This style of the station was coined Populux by historian Thomas Hine. Between 1954 and 64, the use of pastel colors and futuristic lines was represented in Philips stations. One strategy Philips employed was associating the brand with luxury class and higher status, which is reflected in a number of their 1960s advertisements. Another well-established company, Vickers Petroleum out of Wichita, Kansas, began changing their designs in the 1950s as well. Specifically, the Vickers Petroleum service station in Hayesville, Kansas, with its hyperbolic paraboloid batwing design, was the first product of their new program. It was constructed during the year 1956 in Hayesville, a suburb just south of the company's Wichita headquarters. The innovative form of the building was designed and constructed to embody the technological and ambitious spirit of the company as a whole. It was at the forefront of the Futurism style or Googie style. These movements came after the end of World War II when people were looking forward to the technology of the future. This period was the beginning of the space age, which was a source of inspiration for many designers and fabricators of the time. Vickers architect Hickman attended architecture school at the University of Illinois and was an apprentice of Frank Lloyd Wright in Chicago during his university years. After architecture school, he served as a fighter pilot in the Army Air Corps during World War II. Frank Lloyd Wright's influence can be subtly noted in Hickman's designs, including the service station. The low-hanging eaves of the roof shell that are a result of the low convex roof axis resemble the low horizontal planes that Wright designed. The strong orthogonal form and geometry of the columns and planters resemble Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture as well, and anchors the structure to the ground and displaying light filigree infill with the storefront systems. The Vickers service station also particularly displays notes of Hickman's past in aviation with its bat-wing design and light, lofty-seeming roof shell. Many other oil companies and service stations subsequently adopted the style, including Phillips 66. The landscape, which was more frequently traveled, was influenced by architects creating designs evolving well beyond the standard V-shape. Canopy designs were becoming more of an eye-popping signature tied to companies' identities. The Googie style is part of the modern movement, and these styles shunned earlier architectural precedents in favor of more futuristic flair. The term modern age reflects America's mid-century trend toward a new and modernized future, with the concept of automation, advancements in plastics, and expanding industry. The modern age experimented with a more economical and feasible option for construction, pushed the limits of stability of new construction methods and materials. America's fascination with both space and the automobile during the post-war period arguably spurred the Googie aesthetic and brought modernism into our lives via familiar places like gas stations, car washes, and coffee shops. Large and bold signage, dramatic roof lines served as billboards when America's focus shifted to the car. Not to be confused with other mid-century roadside architecture, Googie style takes design further. It's dynamic, sweeping, oversized and cantilevered roofs, soaring canopies, raking angles, metal-framed angular design. Its use of dramatic geometrical shapes, use of large signs and neon, and the use of new materials and mixed materials like steel, glass, plywood, glass blocks, plastic, concrete, and stone. Now, the architecture of these stations is still influenced by the mid-century icons.